Welcome to Straight Shot Politics. Each episode will bring you in-depth discussion with experts, community leaders, and analysts who will share their insights, experiences, and predictions. From local elections to global diplomacy, we'll provide you with the tools and perspectives you'll need to navigate today's real-world landscape.
Welcome to Straight Shot Politics. I'm Lisa Chafee.
And I'm Michael Nash.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited, Mike, because we are talking to Asheesh Agarwal, who's an attorney that has served in senior roles with the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. While at the FTC, he served as Assistant Director of the Office of Policy Planning, where he focused on competition policy. And he currently serves as an advisor to the American Edge Project, and he lives in Indiana. And he's going to talk to us about the threats from China and Russia and what's going on with cybersecurity. So, Asheesh, thank you for joining us today.
Welcome, Asheesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself and the American Edge Project.
Well, the American Edge Project is a consortium of technology companies and trade associations designed to just remind people about how important technology and innovation are to America's national and economic security. You know, the tech companies have been in the crosshairs the last few years, sometimes for very good reasons. But, it's important that, on a bipartisan basis, we keep sight of the fact that it's very, very important that we, maintain our edge and stay ahead of China, Russia, and other authoritarian regimes.
So, what do you think the average person really needs to know about the threat from China?
I think, as Americans, I think we are used to just, assuming that, we're number one. In my lifetime, we've always led the world in technology, from Steve Jobs and the computer age to Neil Armstrong and landing on the moon. Whatever it is, we're number one. Well, it's not necessarily the case anymore, and it's certainly not always going to be the case if we make some bad choices as a country. So, Australia did a study of 44 leading technologies, everything from AI and quantum computing, semiconductors, and found that China is on par or ahead of us on 37 of those 44 metrics. China has, very, very public about it. They want to replace the United States as the world's, leading superpower, and they are investing trillions of dollars to achieve that. They are stealing an average of $500 billion a year annually in intellectual property from the United States. And I'll close with one little quote from the director of the FBI, who said that China's espionage, industrial espionage efforts exceed anything that has ever been seen in human history. So it's a real challenge.
Well, so what kind of things, as an average American, how am I affected by that? I mean, obviously, they're stealing intellectual property. Money, it always trickles down that effect. But what can I, as an average American, do?
Well, first of all, how it affects you, and we're talking about real bread and butter issues of jobs and very sensitive information. So, the FBI director recently told this story about a wind turbine company that based here in the United States, where China was able to infiltrate that company's computer systems, steal its IP, and then start manufacturing those wind turbines in China at a lower cost. Well, because they didn't have to pay for the development of that technology, 700 people lost their jobs, and that factory had to shut down because it lost its IP. In terms of how it might affect you, here's just one very recent example that came to light. The Chinese, Russians, and Iranians collaborated to infiltrate an Israeli dating site. And they took people's personal information from that dating site. And as you can imagine, there's some sensitive things on there, and sold it to criminal syndicates and tried to ransom it to some of the individuals. So if that can happen in Israel, that can certainly happen here. As far as what people can do about it, just a lot of cyber safe practices really encourage people to pay attention to. So simple things like secure passwords, two-factor authentication. Don't email your social security number around, because it's important, for you personally, obviously, but really also important for the country, quite frankly, because a lot of what these countries are doing is trying to get your personal information so they can access your company's server and steal intellectual property that way. So just you as an average American can make a difference.
And I hear that a lot. Excuse me, from a lot of people. They complain all these activities they do at work and all these exercises for phishing and whatnot. We hear people at work saying that, hey, we have to go, and there's a little button we have to go say, hey, if we get a particular email that looks funny, we have to report it, or we have to be on par, we have to be expecting these sort of things to happen, or we got to change passwords every 5 minutes or every 30 days or whatever. We have to have all these different intricate, secure 10-digit long with special characters. Lots of people complain about that, especially now with the population working from home. So with the population working from home, we will probably see a lot of people write their passwords down underneath the keyboard because it's in their house. So with that, you mentioned passwords, you mentioned some cryptic sort of password choices. Is that going to be enough to help out with the security?
Well, that's certainly a start. And Mike, I'm sympathetic to that. My password now, it's like typing in the Gettysburg Address. I mean, it's probably 1,000 characters long, and it can be kind of annoying, but they're there for a reason. Your IT professionals are putting in those protocols, for a reason, and it does make sense to follow them. Another thing we really need to pay attention to is to really, buck up our domestic cybersecurity efforts, and that is government working hand in hand with the private sector and our technology companies. Google, Microsoft, Meta, are spending billions of dollars on cybersecurity training to hire new people. If you're in high school right now, cybersecurity is a great field to go into. Demand is really high. Ohio, for example, employs hundreds of thousands of people in the technology sector. And so by working together, and the government is, and I give the Biden administration some credit for this. They really have tried to focus on cyber protection. That is something else that we can do as a country, really, to support our defenses.
Absolutely. And it's, when I'm looking online, you mentioned online security and trying to protect your identity online. I see constantly in things like Facebook and other apps like that. They'll have groups or chats, or they'll have boards they go to, and there'll be a question asked by someone. Sometimes this person is named anonymous. Will say something like, "Hey, what do you guys think about this particular thing?" And the answer to that particular thing, it could be somebody's password, or it could be an identifying feature about them, either their dog's name, their spouse's name, or a hobby of some sort. And it looks like, I'm not really a trained cybersecurity expert, but I am in the IT field and other life forms. And it's almost pretty easy to see where somebody's phishing for information about someone. They have if they are quote unquote friends of yours on these particular social media apps, if they're in the same rooms as you or in the same chat boards as you, they have your ID. They have some sort of, they can go back and look at your handle and see what you've responded to before. They're building information about you specifically that might create put a target on your back, if you will, or make you a target in some form in the future.
One of the jobs I had in the Trump administration was as general counsel to the Social Security Administration. And, the Social Security Administration, as has, very sensitive information, putting your SSN on, pretty much every American. When I was there, we needed to buy new printers, and the low-cost printer turned out to be, a company that had, associations with, the Chinese Communist Party, because basically every company, in China has, ties to the state. We said no, that we are not going to buy printers at Social Security Administration from a Chinese associated company, because printers these days are basically mini computers, and we were concerned and had the backings of the of the intelligence bureaus not to buy those printers, because we were so concerned about what the Chinese government might do with that information.
Holy cow. So you're talking about printers that were printed or created in China, would they have the ability to call back? Would they have the ability to contact Chinese departments just from a printer? Since they connect to the internet, but would they actually have the ability to take some sort of form of either a scanned document for printing or a document that I had printed? Would it have the ability to send that information back to some sort of mothership somewhere?
That was very much our concern. And look, it's come to light recently that the scope of the cyber hacking efforts are really unprecedented. It's come to light that Chinese state actors are implanting malware in some of our critical infrastructure systems. So in our water treatment facilities, in cranes that we use to load and unload cargo around the country, the electrical infrastructure. And they're not doing that necessarily to spy on us, but there is a concern that if things got really tense with China, that they could activate that malware and shut down some of our critical infrastructure systems. And as far as spying goes, look, I mean, we all probably remember the spy balloon from last year that crossed the country without being stopped. It's come to light that there is a Chinese spy base, in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. There is a real concern, and the reason I feel confident in repeating these things is that it's coming from the intelligence agencies, and let's face it, the intelligence agencies haven't always been right over the last 20 years, but on a bipartisan basis, both Republican and Democratic congressional leaders have looked at this and have said, yes, this is a real problem.
Well, you talked about infrastructure, and I'm looking at an article that's talking about the hearing that the FBI director participated in recently on Capitol Hill. And in this article, it talks about how traffic signals can be attacked. They call it a quote unquote quiet infrastructure revolution, powered by the small startup companies throughout the country, and that even they could attack and turn off the electrical grid, and that would cripple us.
Oh, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Now, I first of all, I give a lot of credit to former President Trump, who really was, I think, the first global leader to really put a spotlight on this concern. I will give some credit to the Biden administration for tackling some of these challenges. So, for example, they are starting to limit the export of the really sensitive dual-use technology, to China and to some of our other adversaries. They have been working with our allies abroad to try to limit the spread of Chinese technology. So, for example, they have convinced Europeans not to adopt the telecommunications equipment from a Chinese company named Huawei, because there was concern about exactly that sort of thing, that the Chinese government ultimately could hijack that technology and really use it to cripple us. Now, where I will short this administration is for their approach to America's technology sector, because we really need to stay ahead when it comes to AI and quantum computing and everything else. And unfortunately, there are parts of this administration that just want to take a wrecking ball to our innovation ecosystem. The ability of small companies to get financing, wanting to break up some of our larger companies for really very, very no good reason.
So I'm going to ask, it may be a kind of a silly question, but cell phones, so much of our technology, so much of our products are made in China. do we need to worry about malware and stuff like that on our cell phones? I mean, so many of us use our cell phones, for our credit cards to, pay at the store. We have all kinds of important, emails on there. If the phone came from China, how do we know it's safe?
That's a fair question. Look, I have confidence in our equipment manufacturers, whether it's Apple, Samsung, et cetera. But you are starting to see this move towards they call it decoupling, where we are trying to in our companies, in partnership with the federal government, are trying to source some of that technology manufacturing, either bring it back to the United States or bring it to friendlier countries like India, Mexico, and I do think that is a good thing.
It is a good thing. Absolutely. But definitely made in America, not just a badge on there, but for security purposes, made in America, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of China, we keep on talking about China stuff. Have you seen the news recently about I'm not going to call it coalition, but it's more of a friendliness between Russia and China. And we always hear about these Russian hacks and how Russia is playing with our political system, and Russia is trying to hack all kinds of other stuff. What is it? What do you think this means for us in the future?
Well, I think for us, it means we really need to partner with the Western governments and our allies abroad who share our democratic values. A new poll came out today from friends at the American Edge Project. They polled 1,000 voters in Europe and the United States, and something like 85% agreed that there is a real need for the Western democracies to cooperate to check that kind of rising authoritarianism from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. We share the same values. We share a lot of the same economic beliefs, and we really do need to work together, like by limiting the spread of Chinese technology. Look, whoever kind of wins this technology race, and it's going to go on forever, but we're in a real critical time now with the growth of AI, and with a fully quantum computer being probably just a few years away. We really need to maintain our edge, and that means working together, across the Atlantic.
Absolutely. And you mentioned these products that are coming over, these chips, these computers, whatnot. Thinking back, I don't remember hardly any of this stuff being made in China 30 years ago.
Well, that gets to a something that's been a real bone of contention in presidential politics, to the rise of China. And I think a lot of folks associated with the former president would say it was a real mistake for the United States to support the growth of China as we did, certainly with technology transfer. Now we can. I mean, that is a much lengthier conversation. But what I will say is, when it comes to advanced manufacturing, sensitive technologies, yes, I fully agree that those things should be manufactured, ideally here in the United States, but certainly with with our friends.
Right. But not harping on this too much, but I guess, why do we get into that? Do we just not? I mean, perhaps it's a longer conversation for a different time, but is it because the stuff is made so cheaply that we decided to have it done in China? And then, because my thought of this is, essentially, China wasn't the superpower it was when we started working with China decades ago. We started working with China, other countries started working with China, they started getting some money, they started getting some power, and then now they're going to take the superpower trophy from us. We essentially paid them to do this. We empowered them to do this to us.
Well, if you go back in the day, China was sort of a card we had against the Soviet Union, right? You remember Richard Nixon, and they talk about playing the China card. And I think a strategic decision was made, probably in the first Bush administration and in the 90s, to try to encourage China's development. And in fairness, you give the Chinese Communist Party some credit. They have made a lot of investments. It's not all intellectual property theft. They have made a lot of investments in technology to expand their own economy. But I think certainly with the benefit of hindsight, I think it's fair to say that yeah, we probably went too far in trusting an authoritarian regime with a lot of our most sensitive manufacturing. And I think certainly former President Trump talks about this all the time. I think there's some recognition on the other side of the aisle too that China is a real problem.
Right.
So, what would you have on your wish list for our lawmakers in DC to put in place to attack this problem?
Yeah, I think number one, it starts here at home with supporting a robust technology center. That is investments in education. That's things like just tax policies and energy policies that are going to encourage growth here at home. AI, it's revolutionary thing. It takes a lot of energy, so you're starting to see nuclear plants are now coming back to support the growth. I think that's a great thing. I think measured law enforcement would be a really good thing. As I mentioned, I do knock the current administration for its very much kind of anti-business approach. Any big corporation now. I read something in the Wall Street Journal that something like 40% of America's large corporations are now under investigation from the Department of Justice, and oftentimes it seems like they're just they're going on fishing expeditions. If you think about Elon Musk and SpaceX and Tesla, so measured genuine law enforcement I think would be helpful. I say that as a former law enforcement official myself. Abroad, I think it's working with our allies. I think it is encouraging Europe, in Australia and India to adopt policies that encourage fair and open trade with the United States, limiting the spread of Chinese technology. I think those would all be very good things.
And then for us average day Americans, we have to, of course, as you mentioned earlier, be more intentional with our own personal security. I used to find the two-factor authentication very annoying until the day I got a notification on my Hotmail account that somebody in Russia was trying to get into my email. So it's little things like that that are going to make a big difference. But what other things can we do? Do we need to keep our eyes open for? I mean, I was looking at this article. It's talking about electric vehicles. I mean, you couldn't pay me to own one of those anyway. But I mean, what is?
Well, they are paying you. They subsidize those to what,
Well, true.
$7,000, $8,000.
Yeah, but
But
I prefer a gas-powered vehicle. In some parts of the country, it doesn't make sense to have it because it gets so cold and they don't work that well in the cold. We're here in Ohio. We don't have too much of that kind of weather, but nonetheless, our government is pushing these electric vehicles. I mean, we know the harm being caused by mining the minerals to make the batteries and everything, but what else? I mean, what other things do we need to be aware of?
Well, I'll just say you're just preaching to the choir with your anecdote there. I think EVs are a phenomenal technology. They work great for some people. Good for them. But the sorts of mandates that we're talking about now coming from Washington, I just don't see how they make a lot of sense. And obviously, they're causing a lot of disruption in Ohio and Michigan and elsewhere. But I think the other things that I would say is I'd encourage people to be on the lookout for opportunities to just to support innovation. And I know that that's really broad, but you can see it in your just even in your local education options. Really encourage your high schools to invest in things like technical training. You can make 6 digits with a high school degree with certificate in cybersecurity, for example. These are great jobs. They're necessary. And while you don't think about it this way on a day-to-day basis, they really are important to the country too.
So with that, delving off on a social thing, with all this focus on social justice, how do we get our kids to become more interested in cybersecurity, welfare of information, good storekeeping habits, being on the lookout, safe practices, those sort of things?
Well, I think some of it is simple. You know, show me the money is part of it. I've got two kids in middle school right now, and they know what's happening with you know, in terms of the economy and where the future is headed, in terms of what, you know, an AI programmer could make these days, or a robotics engineer. I mean, both my kids are on the robotics team. The respective robotics teams. I'm very proud of them. So I think just, you know, letting kids know that they have, you know, a great future available to them with a STEM background, I think is very good. And then in terms of, you know, protecting themselves, you know, the reality is that kids put a lot of things on social media that you know, they should just be very mindful of. And I know that's as a parent, that can be you know, very frustrating to try to educate them. They don't have those you know, decades of experience to fall back on, but just be careful and mindful about what you put on social media, because unfortunately that stuff doesn't really disappear, and it could be used against you one day.
Right. Speaking of social media else, what do you think about this censorship and those sort of things? Is the censorship trying to protect, or is the censorship trying to withhold?
You know, probably a little bit of both. I mean, on one end of the spectrum, I would agree, and I think even, you know, Elon Musk has said that some type of, you know, they call it content moderation is the phrase for that, is helpful, because you don't necessarily want to go on one of these social media sites and see a bunch of, pick your extremist stuff, you know, Nazi stuff, whatever it is. So I do understand that a little bit. On the flip side, I mean, I don't think there's any question that it went you know, a little bit overboard during, you know, the COVID time period, especially some of the things that happened in the last presidential cycle. I think you know, Mark Zuckerberg has, you know, acknowledged it as much that it went too far. So I think the fact that you have a real recognition that mistakes were made, however you want to put that. I think there's a lot more transparency now from all of the social media companies about how they make those decisions. I do have more confidence this is going to be less of a problem going forward. You really haven't heard that many complaints about that this election cycle, because I think there is a lot more transparency now.
Probably because of the the conditioning from last cycle,
Well,
perhaps.
I kind of have to disagree because on Facebook, especially, a friend of mine discovered there's an algorithm that if you post more than 2 times a day, no matter what your affiliation is, left, right, in between, you're getting shadow banned. And I know I'm very prominent on Facebook and Twitter with our Republican groups, and I'm finding that we are getting shadow banned more and more, especially the last couple weeks. But what scares me is, and I'm all about the First Amendment, very much so, but there's a rule, or a law actually, you know, you can't yell fire in a crowded room for a reason, right? So we know that there are people out there, especially involved in the trans community, who are putting harmful messages out there. I don't see them censoring those people either. We know that messages that are targeted directly at kids. So it's a very fine line that we have to, both sides have to come together for protection, but it's gotten crazy. Ashish,
Well,
is there, oh, I'll let you answer that and then we'll wrap up.
well, I was going to say, for the last thing you said, I have heard that the social media companies really will try to, shadow ban some of that harmful content that will, like, encourage kids to, try all sorts of reckless things or put things in their bodies that could really hurt them. Like, they used to have this thing called the Tide Pod Challenge.
Right.
Oh, see if you can eat a laundry pod. Well, what sense does that make? And yes, we all support free speech, but my goodness, some sense. And these are private companies, right? They have their own speech
Exactly.
rights. So the first thing you said, honestly, that should not be happening from a political standpoint. I'm not familiar with that rule. I don't know. Maybe the companies do have a rule that, well, gosh, if you're just posting too much, that's going to be annoying to other users. Maybe something like that. But it really should not be targeted anymore at hey, we're going to limit what Republicans say and not going to limit what Democrats say, for example. So that I'd be surprised to hear that, but I'd be curious to hear if you've taken that up with the platforms and what they say, because my understanding is they've really tried to get away from that.
Well, I'm going to wait till we get through the election, and then I'll deal with that sort of thing. I'm too busy right now. Asheesh, thank you so much for joining
Yeah,
us.
thank you very much.
Where can people go to learn more about what you're doing?
Well, thank you for having me. And if people are interested, check out AmericanEdgeProject.org. We'd love for you to pay a visit.
Wonderful. AmericanEdge.org. Asheesh Agarwal, thank you very much for joining us on Straight Shot Politics.